Okay, thank you, Tal. And welcome to all of you, and welcome, Brad. Great
Thank you,
to
Stan.
be here with us. And as Tal said, I'm going to give a little introduction here to Brad, and then we'll jump into a time of Q&A, and there will be time for you to ask questions as well. So be thinking of questions that you might want to present to Brad. Okay, I think I'll divide my comments here between those things that you probably really don't want to hear because they're sort of boring and always on the Vita, and those things that might be a little more interesting. We'll start with the dull stuff. He is a sociologist. That was a joke.
Thank you, you've been great.
He got his undergraduate degree at UC Davis, which is really an agricultural school. At least that's what we were told when we were growing up. It has blossomed since those days. Majored there in cultural anthropology, and he minored in pre-medicine, so I'm sure there's a story there. He then worked for a few years, but he's not telling us where that was, and then after that he decided to pursue graduate studies, very interested in social psychology. And so he went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the sociology department, which is one of the finest sociology departments in the nation. I was just looking at U.S. News and World Report, and they rated it number 2 in the country. Now, I already knew that because my advisor at Vanderbilt was a Badger, and he used to badger me all the time about how great Wisconsin was. So anyway, good school. After completing his doctorate, he then got an NSF grant and worked for 3 years with the National Consortium of Violence Research. Quite a something to earn at that point in time, and I'm sure it was a great learning experience for him. After 3 years with that NSF grant, he received an appointment at the Sociology Department at the University of Connecticut, where he immediately became a basketball fan, after which they promoted him to associate professor. That's a joke, I'm sorry, very bad. His teaching areas are criminology, social psychology, research methods, and social religion primarily, though I think he's done a little bit beyond that as well. As you can imagine, his vita is long, having published numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, including the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, the American Sociologist, and Journal of Research on Crime and Delinquency, and others. Done quite a bit in the areas of criminology, as well as social psychology and social religion. What you have then here is a very successful scholar in the more typical way of thinking of that. Good schools, good journal publications, impressive grants, etc. But then something rather peculiar happened a couple of years ago, and this will be the interesting part for most of you. He decided to publish a book with the title, "Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Lies You've Been Told. A Sociologist Shatters Myths from the Secular and Christian Media." This was not only the longest title in the history of Baker Books that published it, but was rather quickly followed by another called Upside, Surprising Good News About the State of Our World. Shorter to be sure, but definitely different. These books have been rather well received, at least in the Christian world. And indeed, his first hate-filled book received the CT Book of the Year in the Christianity and Culture area. But one does kind of wonder a little bit about the other part of the world, especially the world that has published all of his research articles. And one of the things I'm going to be interested in asking him is just how this has been received. But that's for a few more minutes. For now, I'd like you to know that in spite of these titles, these are not cavalier ideological pieces at all. Brad is a very good researcher, and I think that really comes through in these works. They're for research pieces or reports on research, they're extraordinarily readable and even winsome. He tells some funny stories on himself in the books. But as good a review of the data as I think I've seen. So they are extraordinary in a number of ways, and I'm very grateful that you could be here to talk with us about your work, Brad. So that's the introduction, and I'm going to jump right into my first question here, which is maybe a bit of an obvious one, but kind of maybe my first question is really how you moved into this this work that you're doing here with these last two books, and especially your book on American Christianity. What was it that led you to take up this topic in the first place? What piqued your interest, I guess? Mm-hmm. And then how has it been received generally? What's been the story there?
Well, first of all, as preface, let me say that I'm not as good as Stan said I was, but it would please me if you believed him. So if, just go with the introduction. Also, I was walking around campus here a little bit earlier, and you guys smile when you don't know people, or when you see people, you smile. It kind of freaks me out. So if I would probably feel more comfortable if you glared, or maybe like every third person could fall asleep or text or something. I think I'd feel more at home with how I teach at the University of Connecticut. So just FYI. In terms of getting into these areas, I have been a Christian for some time. I've been a sociologist for not as long. And about 5-6 years ago, I had this magical thing happen called tenure, which means I can't get fired unless I A, shoot somebody, and B, start making racially insensitive comments, or something of that level. I mean, it's really hard to fire someone who has tenure. And that actually prompted a bit of an identity crisis, because I thought I no longer have to just get a job to have a job and do what I'm doing because it's successful, but I can look deeper into my own values. And so I started looking at how I could integrate what I study and what I believe. And then the next decision is, do I want to study this for a professional audience, the fellow 18 sociologists who would read my book, or do I want to write to a general audience? It's now up to 19 thanks to Stan. And I decided to try to do both. And I don't know if I don't think it was a good career decision from a sociological perspective, but it's been very gratifying for me trying to engage two different audiences at once. In terms of how my work has been received, it's been awkward in my department and in my college, because I'm writing books, they're getting some awards. I'm periodically saying, I have to run upstairs, I have an interview with the LA Times, I have to go do this, and I have to go do that. And so I'm talking to much, much broader audiences than they are. But I'm talking about religion, but I'm not slamming it. If you're going to talk about religion at a secular university, it's helpful if you talk about it, opiate of the masses and stuff like that. But I acknowledge myself as a believer at the start of the book, and I say, okay, let's go where the data go. And so it's sort of been this don't ask, don't tell kind of situation in my department, where they acknowledge that I've written these books. They're not sure if they should count, so they mainly look at my articles mainly. But then they get excited when what I write to a general audience gets picked up by the AP or a major newspaper, because then they look good. So it's kind of this awkward thing. And that's why I didn't do it before tenure, because if I had done it before tenure, I think I'd be folding sweaters at the Gap now or something like that.
Give us a little thumbnail sketch of your work, especially on religion in America. If you had to kind of put it in a short few minutes or whatever, how would you summarize what you've done here, what you've concluded?
Okay. I would say that my work has two themes. One, I play Mythbusters. Have you ever seen that TV show where they say, is this true or not? And then they go blow stuff up? It's like, I would love to do that. So what I try to do with this book, which has a title I don't like, did you know that when you write a book, you don't get to pick the title? I got everything between the covers. That's all me, right there. But they get the cover. It's really weird. So they wrote me with what the title is. So for my second book, I realized I didn't get to pick the title, so I just labeled it Slow Cooker Recipes for the Holidays. That was just, that was the working title. That's what I sent it to them with. I mean, it's like, as long as they don't have a choice, why bother thinking about it? So I play Mythbusters, and then I have a blog that I write on weekly with some other Christian sociologists. And it's really, here's what people think, what's really going on. Sometimes our popular conceptions are accurate, usually they're not. My more scholarly strand of research is focused on field experiments, where I deceive a number of people in public and then try to learn from that. So, for example, we sent out a bunch of job applications, a couple thousand to New England businesses, and we listed somebody who just graduated from college. Again, remember the deceit. And sometimes we said that they were the president of the Evangelical Student Association. Sometimes we said that they had been the president of the Muslim Student Association. Sometimes president of the Jewish Student Association. And we saw how often the employers responded back. This latest study, which is just killing me, it's so much bigger than I thought it would be. We sent out 4,600 emails to churches around the country. And we said, hey, I'm moving to your area. Again, remember the deceit. I lie to both business owners and pastors. Saying, we're moving to your area, and we're looking for a church. Could you tell me a little bit about your church? Signed. And the signature could be a white-sounding name, like Dan Murray, Brian Johnson. It could be an African-American sounding name, like Jamal Washington, a Hispanic sounding name, Jose Garcia, or an Asian name, Jong-Soo Kim. And so we're seeing how often churches respond, and if they respond differently by race, because the letters are the same otherwise, and they actually don't. But that's a different lecture.
What would you say in terms of your observations about American Christianity are some of the more significant misunderstandings or things that we tend to assume about ourselves that don't seem to be backed up by the data? And then I want to know why.
Okay. Well, that was sort of the starting point for where I got into this book, and was that I'd hear these things as a Christian in the church, but then as a sociologist I'd do reading, and they were completely wrong. So the classic example is divorce rates. I've heard in dozens of sermons, and now when I hear it, I send them my book, that Christians have divorce rates as high or higher than non-Christians, and it shows terrible things for us. We need to go to conferences and get more training and yada, yada, yada. It's just not true. It's not true no matter how you slice it, no matter which data set you look at, no matter how you look at it. In fact, Christians have a lower divorce rate than non-Christians, but even more significantly, the more often someone goes to church, the lower their divorce rate. It's a lot lower. So if you compare people who go to church on a regular basis, whether Catholic or mainline or evangelical or black Protestant, it's just a lot lower than the general, than non-Christians, especially non-affiliated. But we just don't hear that. So why is that? So that was one big misconception. Another misconception has to do with the youth. Some of you are young. Enjoy it while you have it. There's this almost cottage industry of scaring ourselves about what's happening to young people in America. Let's see, You Lost Me, I think is sort of the latest version of this, a book out of the Barna group. And there's just numbers of articles and books saying, we're losing the young. Josh McDowell said, is this the last Christian generation? Don't forget to turn off the lights in the churches when you die, kind of thing. And it just isn't true. When you count how many young people are Christians now and compare it to the 90s and the 80s and the 60s, it's about the same, with some variation across traditions. So that interests me, and that's what I tried to do with this book and in my blogging, is basically say, what's really going on? Because for whatever reason, or for various reasons, I won't say for whatever, because I've identified some suspects. The things we believe about ourselves tend to be overly negative and overly pessimistic, and inaccurately so.
Why? And I mean, just a little background to that. It seems to me one of the things that comes through in this book is that it isn't people coming from any one particular perspective that are doing this. That is, when I first read this book, honestly, when I saw the title, and I hadn't talked with Brad yet, I had thought this probably has a little ideological spin to it. You know, it's going to hit one side more than the other. Doesn't. far as I can tell. It seems to me that this problem of assuming wrongly about American religion is sort of across the board. So I'm just curious a little bit as to why that is. Why it is. I mean, clearly we're coming from different places. We have different axes to grind. Mm-hmm. But why is there so much that seems to be out there that does paint a negative picture of American religion? And what are some of the sources of it from your perspective?
That's a nice way to frame it. Sort of, we can be ecumenical in that no matter what our ideology is, we can all come together and accept that things are going badly. So we share that. And it's kind of interesting because usually you think of groups talking about other groups doing badly, but their own group sort of inflating how well it's doing. And so that's why it interested me that within the Christian church we hear so much negative rhetoric. Now, this is what I cover in tomorrow's talk, so if you're going to be at that, now would probably be a good time to check your Facebook status and stuff like that, see what your friends are up to. But I would say the short answer as to why we hear so much negative language about Christianity is that it's useful. There are people within the church and without the church for whom bad news is useful. Now, I'll give a simple analogy. Why do we hear so much about planes crashing? If 1,000 planes land in Logan, they're not going to make the front page. But if one overshoots it by a mile or two and lands in the bay, you will hear about it. By the way, I'm not sure that there's a bay a mile or two from Logan, but work with me on this. In the same sense, what we hear about Christianity is not what is accurate, and it's not even what's necessarily significant. It's what's useful for the person presenting it. So it's useful for newscasters to talk about planes crashing rather than planes landing because they'll get more viewers. Likewise, if you want to have a seminar and get people to attend, or a sermon and get people to listen, or a tape series that you want to sell, or a book that you want to promote, a pretty good way of doing it within Christianity is to scare people. And a good way of scaring people is to tell people things are going badly. Now, the cynic inside of me, which is really big for being a Christian, thinks that if this talk had been titled, There Will Be No Christianity in America in 1 year, we would have like triple the crowd here. And I'm not complaining. Frankly, I'm thrilled that there's more than like 2 or more gathered to listen to me. But just my observation is, if you really want to sell something, if you really want to get people's attention, sell the scare. And so in sermons, you want people to listen to you. And if you have good ideas about how to make the world better, or the congregation better, or lives better, it's sort of an end. The ends justify the means. I'm going to give them good message. I'm going to give them good news. I'm going to give them practical advice, but I want them to listen, so I'll pick out inaccurate facts to set the stage to get their interest. So we hear it from within the church and from without the church. How would we know otherwise? And so we tend to believe the bad news because we hear it so often because it's useful for so many people.
But some of the bad news, or it seems to me the incorrect news, is coming from people who are doing research. I think George Barna, his work doesn't come off too well in your book. Am I oversimplifying? I may be wrong, but it seems like you end up critiquing quite a bit of the conclusions that are drawn from his work. What's going on there?
That makes it tougher because the so-called statistical experts within the faith are saying the same things. Now, I won't speak about Barna's group in particular, although I do end up critiquing them a lot. Let me just say in general that people who make money by selling knowledge have to sell certain types of knowledge. Now, I get a paycheck whether I'm boring or interesting. I get a paycheck whether my findings are significant or not. So I kind of don't have a horse in the race when I do analyses. It's like, let's go wherever the data go. I don't care. So I'm not going to get fired. But if you have what in academics we call like a soft money shop, where you're reliant on what you sell or grants or whatever, you have to be careful what you put out there. So if a group selling research to Christians has to keep an eye on the bottom line. And so not all topics will be of equal sellability. You have to focus on the topics that sell the most and the findings that sell the most. There's also an element of, I come from an academic background, as Stan does, as Tal does, as some of you do, and the explicit training, and not that we necessarily follow this, but we're supposed to follow where the facts go. We're supposed to report things as we see them. At least that's sort of the social scientific approach. It's hard not to get into an ends justifies the mean, whichever way it's supposed to go. Ends justify the means, thinking that I can help the most people if I have this on the cover, or if I have whatever. Now, having said that, I'm guilty of it a little bit myself. I don't like this title. It's a little sensationalistic. And yet this whole book is about don't be sensationalistic. I think if I wrote a book like this now, and I'm a little more confident as an author, I'd say, no, you can't have that title. I don't care if it sells. That defeats the purpose. So, this is one of those casting the stones things.
What have been, may not be a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. What have been the most effective critiques you have received? I mean, people who have come at you, perhaps not liking what you've done. Does anybody hit a home run on that one?
What a terrible question. It's like, here's a rope, go string yourself up. And I can't win, because if I say, oh, there's nothing effective about my work, I look more pompous than I am. Or if I just gut my work, it's like, you guys leave, forget tomorrow, can I grab some cookies on my way home? I would say that the most effective critique hasn't engaged the content as much as the presentational style. So a fact of life in publishing is that people engage stories more than they do figures and numbers. And because of that, this has received I've received a lot of great feedback from like 2 heads of denominations, a lot of pastors, a lot of seminarians, a lot of people who have like degrees after their names. But I think that I pitched it too high in the book market. I think I split the difference too much between an academic book and a popular book. I think it would have been better to focus more on stories and then stuff the numbers into an appendix and sort of, believe me, here's a story, because that's an effective way of communicating. And so I think that's not exactly what you asked, but I think that's been the most effective, the critique that resonates with me the most. In terms of the content, the people who would criticize it the most actually have the least incentive to criticize it, in that the people who use the bad news really have no incentive to call attention to their using the bad news so much. And so for them, it's been just a little more comfortable to ignore it. And I've actually had some awkward, I don't want to make it sound like awkwardness is like an overriding theme of my life, but awkward situations where I've had, like I've been a guest on a show, a TV show, or I've done something with a reporter, and I'll tell them my story, and they'll say, oh, that's wonderful, yeah, we've got to stop doing that. And the next story just exemplifies what I'm talking about. I even have a well-known Christian author, whose name I won't say, who's been very, very supportive of this book and worked hard at pitching it to others. But when it came time for his book to come out, lo and behold, he found the worst statistic possible to motivate it. I don't know what to do. So paradigms are hard to shift. And I think that's what I'm running up against.
By the way, I'm deeply grateful that you didn't write the book as you now said you might, which would be without the data, because I think the strength of the book, in fact, is your ability to show for the reader, and I think it is in a style that people can, people who are used to reading books can understand. There is you do have an ability to communicate, I think, pretty effectively the data. But to me, that's the strongest point you're making is that we need to actually look at the research. We need to look at the data and see what it's saying, as opposed to simply coming to it with our own preconceptions and whatever we want. So in a sense, you're making a very important academic point. So I'm sure that academics really love your book, right?
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm guessing that they don't, because what happens in the book is that academics get critiqued every bit as much as everybody else. And I think, and that's actually something I think we need to hear, because we are, as much as we prize, it seems to me, good research and careful work and making good judgments based upon it, we fall victim, like everyone else, to wanting to promote ourselves, I guess.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me, I guess, about the book is that we as Christians do have certain problems, and that is that we have a very high standard, in a sense, that has been set for us, loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And therefore, there is a sense in which we are going to fail, right?
Most of us.
Most of
I'm just kidding.
To what extent is that part of the motivation that is there behind that? I'm trying to get at now why we as Christians would put out, in a sense, almost false propositions about ourselves. Why do we do it?
Well, I think what you're getting at is that we have kind of a funny standard of comparison. So I periodically irritate. So in addition to awkwardness, we have irritation as the motif here. People, but when they say, oh, this is good or bad, I'll say, well, compared to what? And when we think about how we evaluate the Christian church, it's useful to think compared to what? So the Christian church has problems. Yeah. Compared to what? Compared to just about any other social institution that I can find, we're doing really well. So people go to church all the time. Some of them have problems. They all have problems. Not as friendly as they should be, not as enlightened as they should be, not as generous as they should be, whatever. Well, compared to what? Compared to people who go to church less often, they're doing really well. And so I try to rein in the we're not perfect, so we're therefore terrible logic that pervades a lot of our discussion and the conversation on these issues. It's, Michael Jordan's famous for saying that part of sports is routinely failing. So if I don't know what his shooting percentage was, but he said, if I shot this much, then that means I missed this often. Or with baseball players, if you hit it 1 in 3 times, you're a star. But if you hit it, as I understand some of the baseball players that Eric Gordon are, sorry, a friend of the family is on the baseball team here. But that means you missed 2 out of 3 times. If we were Christians playing baseball, if we applied the Christian logic, it would be, I miss it 2 out of 3 times, therefore I'm a failure. So there's this tension of striving for perfection, but when we don't, and always, but when we don't reach it, not defining ourselves as complete failures. And that's difficult to do. And I think if we err, it's usually on the side of complete failuredom.
Well, one of the interesting things that he does in the book is towards the end, he essentially, let's see if I got the right page here, essentially does kind of a summary where he looks at the data in terms of in a whole range of areas of what we've kind of assumed and what the data really show us. And I thought one interesting thing, or a couple of interesting things, is that in the area of loving neighbor and our attitudes towards our neighbors, that we tend to do much better than we think we do. But there was an area where we don't do as well, and that was in loving across racial barriers, as well as people who disagree with us on certain issues. Certainly the gay issue would be one. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, let's do better. That's part of the problem with making a big problem out of everything. There's sort of a boy cries wolf thing. So if every issue you hear is problematized, which is sort of an academic word of saying, conveyed as this big problem, then we lose sight of the things that really are problems. So what I'm not saying everything's going well. I'm saying most things are going well, but there are some real problems. By understanding what the problems are, we have more energy, we have more money, we have more resources to focus on them if we're not assuming everything's going downhill fast. So however you measure racial attitudes, so it could be, how do you feel if your daughter married, or if your son or daughter married someone from a different race? How would you vote for a black man to be president? Would you vote for a Hispanic man to be president? Should gay people be allowed to give speeches in public? We have all these measures, because sociologists care about these things, of sort of social distance. How far away do you want to keep people who are different than you? It's a good news, bad news story. The good news is that in every group in society, we're getting much more egalitarian very quickly. So compared to even just the 1980s, we do much better in those measures. The bad news is Christians do worse than non-Christians, a fair amount worse. Evangelicals do worse than mainline Christians, and Catholics, mainline Christians and Catholics do worse than the non-religious. Okay, that's fine. We do better than them at a lot of things that we care about, but not as well on this thing. So let's see if we can do better and identify this as a problem area. That's part of what motivated the church study that I told you about, because I want to draw more attention to this and illustrate, yeah, it's really happening in day-to-day interactions within the church and with pastors. So yeah, that is a problem. There are definitely things we need to work on. We should strive for perfection in everything, but there's some things that are worse than they could be, but there's so many things going well. So if I were to summarize, I'd say we're not a drowning, I guess ships don't drown. We're not a sinking ship. We're not the Titanic. Rather, we're a big boat or ship that is headed in mostly the right direction at about 2/3, 3/4 speeds. We can go faster, we can go more true, but generally things are going pretty well. So let's look at where we really are. Let's look at how we're really doing and make course corrections from there.
Is the problem here us? Wow, this is a terrible question. I mean, I'm wondering who has more of the tendency to view American Christians negatively? American Christians or others of us? I mean, in terms of your data.
Well, we think more positively of ourselves probably than some groups in society, but we think negatively about ourselves in terms of how others see us. Now, let me unpack that convoluted statement. There's sort of this belief out there in Christianity that, especially among evangelicals, that others don't like us, that we're being persecuted. And it's getting worse over time. In fact, there's a book written about that. Why am I blanking on the name? It wasn't Revolution. Unchristian. It said basically, they don't like us because we're bad people, so let's be better people so they'll like us so we can pass on the gospel. But sociologists measure these things. It turns out that non-Christians think more highly of evangelicals now than they did 20 years ago. Sort of our public opinion ratings have gotten a lot better. Now, you can debate whether that's good or bad or irrelevant, and I go back and forth on that. But since we sort of have gotten out of politics somewhat, we're not the 1980s Falwell image nearly as much, public opinion has really warmed up. So, yeah, there are discriminatory attitudes toward Christians in society, and that's just part of life. But they're even stronger to some other religious groups. They're much less stronger to others. So Scientologists have it worse than we do. Mormons have it pretty tough. Catholics, mainline Protestants, not nearly as much as, say, evangelicals. But the point I make in my book is that, in a sense, that's out of our control. And even if we acted well, as unchristian would suggest, it's not going to change attitudes. Stereotypes are not based in fact. You may think African Americans commit more crimes, whether or not they do. So the linkage between behavior and stereotypes isn't very strong. My thought is, let's worry about what we think about them. It turns out that we have more negative, our attitudes toward atheists are more negative than the non-religious people's attitudes toward us. That gets to be a problem because we're called to love people, even if they don't believe with us. And so my thought is, let's not worry about what others think of us, let's worry about what we think of others. And let's love people even if they disagree with us about our religion, and certainly if they look different from us or act differently from us.
I'm going to ask one more question here then and open it up for questions from all of you. But I'm going to ask you to put on your more psychologically inclined brain here and do a little analysis of me, because one of the things that came to me as I was reading your book was that I think I have a tendency to, when I look at my friends who are Christians, whom I know, I do not think of them as hate-filled hypocrites, etc. In fact, they're a pretty good group. Mm-hmm. But when I think about Christians beyond them, who I don't know, I have more of a tendency to assume such things. Why? What's going on? What would be the what's the reason for jumping to that conclusion, I guess? That's what I'm asking. Any wisdom?
That's a great observation. I actually hadn't thought of it in those terms. I've thought of that dynamic with other things. So in my second book, I devote a chapter to that. It's called about how people think the world's going. Most Americans think their life is getting better and that everyone else's life is getting worse. So it's this weird thing that the grass is browner on the other side of the fence. And most Americans think their financial situation is getting better, but the economy is getting worse. Their family's doing better, but families in America are doing worse. So it's kind of this bizarre disconnection. I've also heard people say, well, my youth group is doing fine, but we're losing the young nationwide, which is the same dynamic. And I got to tell you, I'm not sure. I think part of it is that we use different evidence. I think we use better evidence for our own lives because you observe it yourself. When you go beyond your life, you have to rely on the reports of others. And then that gets filtered through the whole, what I call Christian fear narrative, because as academics, we get extra points if we make up like long nouns. So we judge everyone else based on what we hear from the pulpit, from the media, from critics, but we judge our own lives based on what we see. So I would imagine that most of you, we could expand that and actually make kind of a nice study. Most of you think that your Christian friends are really nice. I know for a fact that, for example, students at a certain Christian college smile at you when you walk around kind of lost, in a way they don't at secular schools. So that's sort of nice evidence against the paradigm, and powerful too, because it relies on stories. So do you see the power of stories? So if I say here chart after chart after chart that you're wrong, Christians are doing fine, I don't know if that'd be as effective as saying, base it on what you think of your own life and generalize from there. You'll probably be closer than listening to the surveys that you hear.